Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of the show for 2022. Let me begin by wishing each and every one of you a happy new year. Of course, New Year is a time when lots of people make resolutions about how they're going to behave differently in the coming year. One of my resolutions for 2022 is to be kinder. So I thought it would be a good idea to use the first episode of the show this year to help me to achieve that by inviting an expert on kindness onto the show. Not only will that help me and you to have a better understanding of what kindness is and why it matters, but it will also ensure that my New Year's resolution is made public and hopefully therefore more likely to be achieved. Let's see. Of course, if you're going to hold me to that resolution, you'll need to understand what kindness is. My guest who will guide us through all things kindness is Sebastian Boo. He's a trainer, tutor and researcher at the London School of Economics and Political Science and the founder of Kindness Advantage, a company that brings kindness training to the workforce. During our discussion, we explore what kindness is, in particular why it might not mean what we tend to think it means, why it matters, and what we can practically do to be kinder. So, with my New Year's resolution ringing in our ears, and with my very best wishes to you all for 2022, here's my discussion with Sebastian Boo on kindness. Sebastian, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Hi, Christian. Thanks very much for having me here.
I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here. And look, I know who you are, but many of my listeners might not. Can you give us a little bit of a pen portrait?
So I'm Sebastian Boo, and I am a kindness champion and trainer. So admittedly, those are self-proclaimed titles, but my credentials for doing that are that in 2015, I founded Kindness Advantage, and we're a training company, and we help clients to harness the power of kindness to optimize culture, team performance, strengthen purpose and leadership, and improve performance. I'm also a researcher, so I'm based in the Department of Management at Birkbeck College, University of London, and I also work as a academic tutor and disability advisor, something I've been doing for 10 years at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and there I've got responsibility for about 300 students that are neurodiverse, so they've got conditions such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, and attention deficit disorder. So that's me professionally.
Well, that's quite a lot together. And I guess that you mentioned kindness up front, and you said the couple of titles that were there. Can we, before we go and sort of explore what those mean, can you tell us what do you mean by the word kindness, and why does kindness matter?
Fantastic. So look, what does kindness mean? And it's such a good question, Christian, because I think sometimes people misunderstand what's meant by kindness, and they understand it as being, nice or overly friendly. So kindness means, in the way I'm using it and the way I do the research about kindness, is a commitment to promoting well-being and reducing distress or suffering. So it's action that's intended to promote well-being and or reduce distress and suffering. And well, why is it important? Well, because there's a lot of suffering out there in the world, of course. And we know that promoting well-being is not just a nice thing, it's incredibly important. When people feel better, they're healthier, and they perform better in almost every single domain of human endeavor and activity. So kindness, the strongest scientific case for kindness is that it fuels well-being. So we've kind of understood now that well-being is important. Certainly organizations and companies have cottoned on to that. We've got the stats for that. In the United States, people taking time out of work because of low well-being, because of issues to do with mental health, costs $400 billion a year. In the UK, it's $40 billion. So we know that poor levels of well-being, people not feeling right, mental illness is very costly, not just in terms of human suffering, but also the consequences of that.
And so when we think about that, as you say, you mentioned this sort of stereotype of kind of
it can be perceived as a weakness, right? Too kind. And so you're talking about logic that would also take us, and I'll use an extreme phrase here. I know that you don't quite mean going this far, but there's a sort of phrase, you've got to be cruel to be kind. In other words, kindness doesn't necessarily just mean being nice to people. You could be kind to someone by pointing something out that's potentially by criticizing them.
Absolutely. Kindness shouldn't be equated with being nice, because being nice, as you sort of intimate there, can sometimes be understood as not necessarily giving somebody that really candid feedback. And so if we want to improve well-being and reduce distress, particularly in the long run, then there are times that you do need that honest feedback. I mean, I've certainly benefited from my friends telling me, hey, look, that you weren't doing the right thing there, and telling me something I needed to hear. And that's what you'd expect from the people who love and care for you. So, no, kindness isn't always about being super nice and sugarcoating things and avoiding perhaps difficult conversations.
So I think we all intuitively understand the idea of simply sort of supporting other people. And we recognize, we've seen this through COVID, that we are bound to other people in all sorts of different ways and dependent on people in all sorts of different ways. And that might be in an employment context. Maybe it's suddenly we've recognized the value of healthcare providers, the sort of invisible people that keep our world moving. And we've recognized in ourselves, a lot of us, what's important to us, and possibly things that didn't matter before. So there's a greater awareness around this piece than perhaps there has been in the past. But I'm intrigued as to, on the face of it, we recognize the significance, and yet clearly there is. You wouldn't be talking about the subject if it was something that we all naturally practiced. And I'm intrigued as to why is this a challenge for us? Why doesn't this happen naturally?
Yeah, exactly. That is the big question, right? So as human beings, we know that we've got the capacity to be anything but kind, right? We don't need to read the papers for very long or study much history to be confronted with, just general nastiness to atrocities, right? So just as we have it within us to be hugely compassionate at times, we also have it within us to be nasty, cruel, and not very considerate of others. So that is such an important question that we need to explore, and we need to action the answers to that question. So we can think of kindness as a skill as well, as a behavior and a skill. And what we want to be able to do is figure out what can we do to turn up our capacity for kindness and turn down our capacity for not being kind. And there are various inhibitors and facilitators of kindness. And what we want to do is understand what are our facilitators of kindness and what can we do to promote them. What can we do to facilitate our capacity for kindness? One thing there, of course, is empathy, the ability to put yourself in the position of another, to be sensitive to the emotional needs of another, to resonate emotionally with what's going on for other. Empathy can be one facilitator of kindness, and lack of empathy can obviously be an inhibitor of kindness.
And how do we sort of start to think about this? Because if I took your thing and saying, be kind to people, it's great instruction. I sort of conceptually understand what it means. And yet, because of the hang-ups potentially that we all have, and for all sorts of good and less good reasons, our natural tendency might not be to do that. How do we start to think about being kinder?
Well, I think there are two pieces there. One is what I call the psychoeducational piece, which is telling people a little bit about what we now know about the benefits of kindness from a science perspective, so that people know that kindness is not just being nice, it's smart. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the intelligent thing to do. So letting people know, look, when you're kind, you're having a positive impact on your health and the health of the people around you. When we promote and facilitate kindness in a team, we support and boost the fundamental resources that we need as individuals and collectively to perform at our very best. So kindness helps us achieve what we want to achieve in any case, and helps us to avoid the things we don't want to have happen in any case. So it's an overarching strategy for success. Explaining that is where it first starts, and then I think the second bit is then how do I facilitate? Because I get all that, I've been studying that, I know it, but I still struggle. Well, I struggle a lot. I'm not more kind than I would say, you, Christian. So I know that there's a personal bit there as well, where I have to work on my own self-kindness, my own capacity to get in touch with where I'm at in any given moment. And so that when I'm stressed or in a difficult situation, I nudge myself a bit more to behaving with kindness, compassion, and wisdom. And that requires, I think, certainly in the first instance, an ability to self-regulate, control one's levels of stress, because when you're stressed and worked up, it's very difficult to be kind often.
Obviously, we sort of need to deal with ourselves before we can shift onto other people. And it's interesting, your comments around our own capacity for kindness to other people is clearly driven by our own state of mind. So if I'm tired, cognitively depleted, irritated, any of those sorts of things, that's going to have an impact on my one, I guess, a very simple level, my ability to make to go the extra mile, make the effort. If I don't have the energy to do it. But secondly, the mood and the energy that I transmit towards other people. So I guess it does, from what you were saying, does start with looking at ourselves.
Sure, exactly. And it may be helpful for us to sort of conceptualize kindness as the three parts of kindness. So in the book, I've got an iceberg. So and this is also the way that kindness is measured. So Professor David Cantor and colleagues have just recently produced a really psychologically robust scale of kindness, and it also measures it in this way. So when we think about kindness, we've got the kind behavior itself, whatever that is. You helping somebody who's dropped some papers on the floor, or helping a friend out in distress. You've got the kind action, right? That kind action is a consequent to two sort of preceding things, and that's what goes on inside your own mind, your own inner psychology. And there the two factors are, first, the initial awareness that there is an opportunity to be kind. And then you've got the intention or the motivation. So I could be aware that, you might benefit from me opening the door, but I then don't follow through with an intentional motivation to do anything about it. So those are the psychological ingredients. What psychologists call the antecedents for kindness are that initial awareness and sensitivity to the possibility, to the need of either reducing the stress or promoting well-being. And then on top of that, the intention and the motivation to take some action. And then finally, the action itself. So if we want to facilitate our own ability to be kind, we need to be thinking about, well, how do I become aware initially that there might be a need to be kind, or there might be a possibility to be kind? And then beyond that, we need to be thinking about, well, how do I have the motivation or the intention to then follow through on that awareness? And of course, as you were saying, if you're tired or you're stressed, I might say, oh, well, I could go and help so-and-so over there, but to hell with it, because, that's their problem and I'm tired and whatever. So we can work on those inner ingredients of kindness and see what we can do to facilitate and boost them. So there's an issue there also with sort of relying on our own motivation to be kind. And that's, if you like, a little bit the difficulty with empathy. And there's a great book by a psychologist called Paul Bloom entitled Against Empathy. And he makes the case there that, we shouldn't really make ourselves dependent on empathy in order to be kind, because there are many situations in where kindness is needed, where we're not going to have that empathetic response. And so in terms of those inner psychological ingredients, that's where our principles and our values come in. If you've got a clear principle, if you've got a clear value that I want to be a kind person, or I'm a leader and I want to make sure that I lead where possible as a kind leader, holding on to that principle, having that clarity about that value can help ensure that you take an opportunity to be kind, even when possibly you don't feel like doing it. And I suppose that also we can relate to that often, in family situations. I've got an elderly father at the moment who's got sort of dementia, and he needs help. There are many times I don't feel like helping him at all. I'm tired and I've had enough. But I want to behave in a way that's consistent with the person I want to be, with the son I want to be, with the human being I want to be. And that makes sure I do whatever needs to be done in that particular context, even though I don't feel like doing it very much.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting example, because you sort of know that you should, and I can make a very cogent argument as to why that in the longer term that will feel like a good thing to do. But if you look at lots of other acts of kindness, there are lots of things where we have to put ourselves out in ways that are, or feels like we have to put ourselves out in big ways. And the second thing is there's possibly a fear of doing that because of the potential consequences. So if I think about a sort of simplistic example, if I go help a stranger, maybe I'll get embroiled in something that is beyond that. Maybe I don't know, maybe they're trying to con me, or there's a whole load of arguments I could come up with as to why kindness might be equatable with gullibility or whatever. The perceived risks are potentially quite high. How do we think about that?
It's a good point that you're right. I mean, there might well be a risk that if you're kind to somebody, certainly they may not reciprocate. They may not take kindly to your attempt at kindness. What can we say about that? I mean, for me, those wouldn't be strong enough reasons to not go ahead and be kind. Because overall, in the long term, I think kindness generally is going to pay off. It's not as you're right, it's not straightforward. There may well be, particularly when there are power dynamics going on, if I'm kind to somebody who's subordinate to me, they may worry that I'm expecting something in return, or they may feel a certain pressure to perhaps comply with a subsequent request. Similarly, if I'm kind to somebody who's senior to me, it may come across as me being sycophantic. So I think what's important there is the purity of the intention. We have to be also a bit careful of what I would call fake kindness, which means people, seeking to seem to be kind, but really they've got an ulterior motive. And I think we need to watch that in our own selves as well. And I would say that kindness properly defined, in my view, should be freely given. There's an innate benevolence to kindness. You're not kind to the stranger because you think they're going to help them out. It's a gift. You're giving something to them, and there's an inherent benevolence in that and generosity in that. And it may well backfire, but I would say by and large, if people, we're very good at detecting when people are not being authentic. And I think that if somebody is authentic in their intention to help them, more often than not, that will be well received. And in the circumstances where they don't need the help or they don't want the help, I think that they would just politely turn you down. But most human beings are going to respond positively to another human being being intentionally wanting to support and help them.
And as you were talking there, it sort of struck me, there's a little bit, and this is a very primitive argument, but let me make it anyway. There's a karmic logic to what you're saying there, which is that if you set out to be kind, in very crude terms, the universe, and we could add religious connotations or anything else to this, will sort of pay it back to you. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing I'm a bit wary of is because kindness is such an inherent component of all the world's faiths and certainly Buddhist philosophy. The arguments for kindness that come from the spiritual realm, that come from religion, and that even come from ethics and philosophy are already really well made. So I try to avoid drawing upon those and making the case for kindness based on sort of science and rationality, because there's not much that I can add to what's already, to what the great sages have already said. But we've now got a data-driven case for, if you like, the karmic argument that kindness does spread and come back. So to give you an example, there was a study was done with a couple of hundred employees in the Coca-Cola company. It was in Spain, actually, and they ran a kindness intervention whereby a group of employees had to consciously engage in some kind acts towards other employees. And they followed these people up. And not only did the well-being of the givers and the receivers of kindness increase substantially, the receivers who were on the receiving end of a colleague being kind to them went out and, without being asked to do this, engaged in kind acts themselves. And they did that 278% more than the employees who hadn't taken part in the study. So when people are kind to you, according to this study, there's a 2.7. You'll be more likely to go and be kind to others, nearly 3 times more than if you haven't had people being kind to you. So, and there are other studies that show that that there's a network effect, that when somebody's kind to you, you're far more likely to sort of pay it forward and be kind to somebody else. And if we think about it, we're all networked in. There's this meme that we're all connected to other people on the planet, and there are only sort of 6 people between us and everybody else. And we can model our society as a dynamic, complex network. And we can think about how if the behavior between those individual components of the network changes, eventually it shifts the whole behavior of the complex system. So you make a good point. Kindness does spread, and if it spreads, it's going to benefit us all, because we're all living in the same environment. And we see countless examples of that over COVID as well. So it's almost as if our biology knows that kindness is something that's good for us, which is why we feel good generally when someone is kind to us, and we witness kindness. So evolutionary psychologists argue that kindness was a trait selected for by evolution, because it helped our ancestors survive and thrive by ensuring that people looked out for each other, cared for each other, particularly in the midst of dangers and threats. And whilst we're no longer living in sort of hunter-gatherer tribes, kindness is still essential if we're to thrive and be healthy. And we're seeing now sort of, for us to perform at our best in groups and ultimately at a societal level. Kindness is a fuel that is important if we're to be healthy. And I would argue, if we're going to successfully face the increasingly complex and difficult challenges of the 21st century.
That brings me back to the earlier question around, okay, if we understand intuitively it's a good thing, then why is this not happening of its own accord? And it strikes me that's not just a 21st century problem, because if people did this naturally, then you wouldn't need to have all of these things written down in the scriptures and it would just be happening anyway. And so I'm fascinated about this idea if it's such a good idea and so blindingly obvious to us, why don't we do it?
Yeah, so great question, Christian. I think we need to be thinking about our psychology once again. What is it in our makeup that facilitates our ability to, as you say, not be kind, and why is it that we need to sort of, if you like, remind ourselves of this? So I think that's partly to do with our ability as human beings to readily distinguish who is, if you like, an in-group member, who belongs to our tribe in inverted commas, and who doesn't. And we know that when human beings identify others as being not part of the group they belong to, it then becomes very easily to treat those other people with a lack of humanity in extreme circumstances. So I think that's one of the problems of being very quick to draw boundaries in our own mind as to who is brethren, who is clan, who is an in-group member, and who isn't. And then being very focused on doing what's right by us and the other members of our group, and to hell with the others. So I think that ultimately is probably one of the biggest challenges that we face to kindness. And so the question is, how do we expand that circle of common humanity? How do we ensure that people who are different to us, that we consider them to be like us? And there we have to work against our own psychology. So we know that we have the capacity to very quickly identify others as, different ethnic minority, different ethnic background, different religious persuasion, different political leaning, different socioeconomic class. They're different to us. Therefore, we don't have to have the same sensibilities towards their well-being as, our own family, the people who live perhaps next door to us, and the people who look and sound like us. So that's one of the challenges I think we face now. How do we expand our sense of common humanity and connect at a level that's deeper than socioeconomic indicators, that's deeper than differences in language and culture? And if we were able to do that, then we'd make a huge advance as a civilization, I would say. The other factor I think to be thinking about in relation to this is our perception of scarcity of resources and competition. I mean, if people felt that there was more than enough for everybody, I think there'd be far less conflict. There'd be far less need to defend and protect ourselves. There's an interesting story from the Isle of Skye, which, for hundreds of years was a fishing community. Most people.
So for non-UK listeners, this is, I'm going to get this wrong, but correct me where I've got this wrong. This is an island off Scotland.
That's right. It's an island off Scotland, and people have lived there for hundreds of years fishing. And the way they would operate would be that once the fishermen caught their catch, they would, give it to. They would have it for their family, and any leftover catch, and there was always leftover catch, would be sort of distributed freely to those who might not have enough, and it was shared across the island community. And there wasn't ever a great need of, people weren't left without. And then when refrigeration was brought in and people were able to have refrigerators and were able to then store their own fish, this sharing of the leftovers with everybody else didn't occur anymore. And then you started to have issues with people being without and poverty, and then the need to come up with some kind of structured welfare or social support system. So there's something there about how we think about the resources that our planet offers us, how we distribute them, and how that might lead to less of the problems we've got today. With the very obvious lack of access to basic resources that so many people have, both in our country and more obviously in developing nations. So there's something to do with the mindset there, how we think about collection of resources, whether that's capital or other things, and how we distribute it among ourselves in a way that ultimately might reduce suffering and also promote well-being. And I can see how that might link into conversations about what's it called now? Not universal credit, but sort of a universal basic income and things like that. And my understanding is, although I'm not familiar with the literature on that, but there are well-argued papers that say that something like universal income would ultimately save huge amounts of money compared to the extent to which the welfare state is costing us at present.
I'm fascinated by the resources piece. And the refrigeration story is really interesting because I would have seen refrigeration as a force for good, right? Which is stuff doesn't go to waste. But you've rightly pointed out it's driven a really interesting behavior, which I originally thought the reason you might share food with other people was because in case one day they have food and you don't, it's a sort of smart bartering system and it's kind of buying some credit, if you like. But therefore that logic would continue to apply post refrigeration. But of course, you point to other things then kick in. I think it's interesting when you talk about resources, because that presumably is what drives the sort of the idea that, that epitomized by former president of the US. He talks about winning and losing, and the vocabulary is all about sort of, for me to win, you have to lose, and it's driven very much around that mindset. And so, a lot of the things that you say, I think, fascinatingly ring true and deviates from that course. And if we could remove that logic that says I have to look after number one first, then we could start to unpick something. And you're right. Then in that world, the logic of I have to look after myself, and if I look after you, I'm somehow not looking after myself, starts to fall away a bit.
One of the things that, I figured out some time ago is that truth is often paradoxical, and what we need to be able to do is be flexible. And there are many situations where that holds, right? The famous put your oxygen mask on first and then look after the others. I mean, that is true. Or care for yourself first so that you can care for others in terms of a health and well-being point of view. But equally, this sort of zero-sum mindset where I win, you lose is incredibly unhelpful in many situations. And I think we need to sort of be more rigorous in identifying where the zero-sum game mindset is doing us more harm than good.
So I'm always fascinated talking to my guests about how their subject matter impact them directly. You've talked a little bit about your I guess I'm not applying a higher standard to you than anybody else, but at the same time, you've thought about this more than the average person. And so in many respects, if you can't make it work for you, then the rest of us are going to struggle. So I'm intrigued as to how do you, you gave the example of your father, but you're just sort of thinking more generally is how do you get yourself to be more kind? How are you changing the way that you think about the world and you do things? So I guess I'm asking for practical tips really for how to think about this.
Well, obviously, I try to sort of practice what I preach, but that's difficult. So, if you like, there's the principle component. There's this is supposed to be one of my values, one of my ethics. I'll try and practice the ethic of kindness. But I think what I really need to be doing, if I'm to sort of develop emotionally as a human being, psychologically, is really work on my own capacity to be kind, and that has to do basically with how I treat myself, how I talk to myself. And I know that, because of my personality and my upbringing, that I still tend to be really harsh on myself and self-critical. And that doesn't help me. It certainly, it's certainly in the past affected my own health. So the answer to the question is, if I want to be a kinder human being, where I need to invest really is working on my stuff. Exercising self-kindness. And I think every single person's capacity to fulfill their potential for kindness has a lot to do with how much emotionally unprocessed things we've got going on. And that I might be opening a bit of a difficult topic here, but I think one of the things that I've seen. So I've worked with over 10,000 students over the last 10 years in through my work at universities and my coaching and academic tutoring work, and I can see how there are many people out there who are who by simply being a virtue of being alive and sort of living in society have had things happen to them that they haven't fully worked through, and it's holding them back. It's holding them back from having the courage to take the risks they need to take in order to fulfill their potential, or it's giving them unnecessary sort of anxiety in certain situations. And these are all people who they don't have some clinical diagnosis of anxiety or depression. They're just not entirely fulfilling their potential in life. And the only thing that's holding them back is, I think, their own selves. And often that's a bit of, that's fear of failure, self-doubt. And all those things, I think, can be slowly dissolved if people were to have, unconditional positive regard for themselves, unconditional love for themselves. If they really knew that whatever happens, I'm okay, and that whether I succeed or fail at this particular endeavor, I'm still okay. And so many people tie up their self-worth to external markers of reality, of success. For me, for many years, it was about, if I qualify as a medical doctor, then, I'll be happy with myself. If I make this sort of turnover, I'll be happy with myself. If I get my PhD, I'll be happy with myself. And I see this replicated many times in lots of people. And I think it really limits one's capacity for well-being, for for feeling ultimately happy with oneself. And I think it also gets in the way with people fulfilling their own potential and playing to their strengths, because so often people are chasing the things they think they need to do in order to get that validation, in order to be successful. And often there's not a massive crossover between what, if you like, in inverted commas, their God-given gifts are, what their own innate strengths and talents and passions would have them do, and the sort of thing that they're chasing. And I've seen many cases of students or people mid-career who's sort of in a crisis because they're saying, I've worked so hard to do this, but it's just not resonating. It's not, they're not passionate about what they do, and they are, a little bit spiritually killing themselves. So I'm making a long-winded argument for really saying we really need to ramp up our own capacity for self-kindness. And what that means in a simplified way is really valuing oneself as one is, just as you would do for anyone else you love in your life. If you've got, family or a partner, you don't value or love them for their achievements. I mean, you're happy for them when they do well, and you're disappointed for them when they don't achieve something. But your admiration, your value, your love for them is unconditional. And if we were able to do that to our own selves, it would liberate so many of us, I think. And you can see that both in small ways, but also, in big ways. If you think of all the narcissists in the world, and when we all can have that tendency, if they were able to really massive up their own self-kindness, that would help them a lot. You mentioned the former president of the United States. So self-kindness can help our own well-being. It can help us fulfill our potential by giving us the courage to be who we truly are in the world. And there's a piece there also about inclusion and diversity, and people being authentic to, whoever they are, whatever their characteristics in terms of their sexual orientation or, their ethnic background. And of course, when individuals are able to fully accept who they are, if I can fully love Sebastian as he is, with his quirks, with his foibles, with his difficulties, with his strengths and weaknesses, it becomes so much easier for me to love the next person, whatever their sexual orientation, whatever they look like, whatever their class, however they sound, whatever school they've been to, whatever their job, whatever part of the world they come from. And I know myself, I've seen how my own prejudices vis-a-vis other people. And that's me who, has worked partly 10 years as a disability advisor. That's me who, is doing a PhD on kindness. Because of the stuff, the things I've done, I can watch my own prejudices come up and my own barriers coming up, saying, I'd rather not, get involved with that person. Whatever. So I think a lot more self-kindness, which I think could be taught in schools. And it's not about being, soft and nice and letting ourselves stay in bed all day eating chocolate. It's about really valuing who you are so that you can have the courage to be who you are, and then go out there and contribute as best you can. I think if we worked a lot on that, we would help reduce mental health crisis that we've got. We would help people have a lot more purpose and meaning in their lives. We would definitely improve the quality of relationships between people. I mean, nearly half of marriages end in divorce. I mean, horrendous figures with abuse. I mean, that's, again, a slightly different thing. But there's so many of the problems we face as a society, I think, would be solved if we could really increase our own capacity to care and love for ourselves, because that would improve how we interact with everybody else. And it would help shift the mindset that we've got about, I need to protect me, this very sort of defensive. You talked about, win or lose. Win or lose really is about, I need to look after me. And what fuels often that sort of hyper-competitive spirit is hyperactivation of our threat system, that we feel constantly under threat. And that threat is a psychological internal threat that we're not good enough. Because nobody in the developed world needs to worry that they're not going to have enough food or shelter or have their basic needs met. The threat that affects most people in the developed world is a threat that they're not good enough, that they don't compare socially well enough to other people. And that, I think, fuels all sorts of problems, from hyper-consumerism to the mental health crisis, to people behaving ungenerously towards others, and ultimately, probably at a grand scale, to conflict throughout the world, armed conflict.
Wow, and I love that, by the way, because I think not the armed conflict, to be clear, but just your what you were talking about there, because I think that when I look at where are we eroding human capital and sort of not getting the best out of everybody in society. Well, the answer is where people are doing things that they're not good at, that they don't really enjoy for ultimately bad reasons, or they're having to pretend to be something they're not. And I was struck by your comments around, for example, sexuality. The stress levels of someone that is unable to admit who they truly are because they're worried about what other people will think. And in some cases, that is a matter of life or death, right? There are people that are under pressure where if you were to come out and say you were gay, that poses genuine risk to your life in certain contexts. That's sort of, but there's other people that just do it because they want to fit in and they kind of go along, and it's easier not to be honest yourself. But that, as you point out, is exhausting. Because in effect, you're having to act all of the time. And we know how hard work acting is and faking it actually is. It's cognitively depleting. And so I think there's a really interesting thing you've raised there, really around, I think where people can do it, we should be helping them to do it. And clearly there are circumstances, you talked about the developed world versus the developing world. Clearly there are people who are in so much poverty that they don't have they have to do whatever to get through. But there's a lot of people who are not in that situation, who are still trapped by things. And it struck me that as you were talking, when I think about who are the kindest, most generous people, it's very often the people with nothing, who are most willing to share, who have the, in sort of conventional logic, you'd be going, well, they've got absolutely, why are they so willing to share and be simple in your language, to be kind to others? And I think these things do seem to me to be correlated. There is something fascinating about development, quote unquote, that takes us away from that basic human thing. And the further if we move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example, the further we get away from those basic things, the potential for trappings to come in that change that are quite substantial.
Mm-hmm. And this sense of ownership, I think our mindset around personal possession and our justification for to do with what's personal property. And it's always struck me as phenomenal, the vast assets that are held often by such a small number of the population, the opportunity cost in terms of how those assets or how that wealth could impact human lives, has always struck me as phenomenal. If it's a really difficult one, because on the one hand, I wouldn't want to live in a world where people didn't feel incentivized to work really hard and achieve great things and be massively successful. But on the other hand, when we've got the facts about how wealth is distributed in the world, it's so patently obvious that there are vast amounts of wealth that could do so much to alleviate suffering in other parts of the world that are locked up in assets that very few people control, and there seems an imbalance there. And I think at some point we need to be thinking about how we tackle this issue. How in 2021 we've still got nearly 2 billion people on the world at risk of dying because of lack of food and hunger, lack of food and safe running water. When we've got, on the other hand, we've got increasing numbers of billionaires, multi-billionaires. So it's as if we look at our civilization, nobody would set up to design a civilization with such disparities in wealth distribution. It just wouldn't be a clever design. So I think what we want to be doing is thinking about, okay, how do we design our global society so that it's a more highly functioning one? And the problem is, of course, that will challenge perhaps those of us who are doing very well at the moment with the current setup. But ultimately, we probably need to be thinking about what sort of world we bequeath to the future generations, and also the pressing challenges we face right now, in particularly to do with climate change. So I think we just need more conversation between people of difference, and to really strengthen that sense of common humanity. That is what I think we really need to do, is to strengthen our sense of we're all on this planet together, and we're all on this little blue speck in the universe. And how are we gonna make sure this place works out? And the solution isn't that we'll all just jet off to some space station and live happily up there. Surely the place is how do we get our global civilization functioning better, and reduce and eliminating so many of the problems that we have, which are man-made. I mean, we've created all the problems, we've got most of them. So surely it should lie within our own creativity and ingenuity to sort them out. And I certainly believe we can do that, but we've got to really work across these cultural differences, these cultural boundaries, and we've got to see each other as a common humanity, not as one member of one group, and just really eliminate those perceptual barriers.
Can you talk a little bit about technology? And I'm thinking computers and communications as opposed to sort of developments like the fridge, but feel free to take this wherever you want, because I mean, it strikes me that if we looked at something like social media, where tremendous force for good in some respects, right? Connecting people, building bridges. On the other hand, we've got the flip side of the sort of echo chamber, radicalization, Cambridge Analytica, blah blah. How do you see that? Because I'm really struggling with this, and maybe I'm looking for a simple answer from a complex situation, but I sort of think actually things like TripAdvisor to expose businesses that rip tourists off on a simple level. We've got people's ability to go undercover and expose ethical issues within companies they work for or things they have seen. So citizen journalism. So, flip side, fake news, polarization, all those things. How do you think about those dynamics?
You're right. I mean, technology is a tool, and it can be used for good and for harm. As you said, it can really accentuate all those social comparisons, and we know that one of the contributors to the increasing mental health problems among young people is partly to do with the fact that people can engage in social comparisons so much more. And when you've got the whole world to compare yourself to, well, nobody's going to match the looks of the world's most attractive model. The competition becomes global, and there will by default always be people who are better than you at something or other. And those upward social comparisons, particularly for young people when they're sort of still forming their sense of who they are, can have a really negative effect on well-being and self-esteem. The other negative issue, you're right, is that people can be in, if you like, social media silos where they only connect with other people who've got the same ideas as them. So that might all be very nice for people interested in compassion, making the world a better place, but it can also mean that people with violent or even abhorrent views can also sort of connect and encourage themselves more. As you also said, there are lots of positives that could be that technology affords us, particularly in terms of connection. So it strikes me that the way that we start to address some of these issues is by facilitating good quality connections between people. I've benefited so much across my life from having connection with people from different cultures, spending time with people different to me, and then finding out that basically we're all human, and basically we've all got the same kind of human needs. And technology, I think, could facilitate that a great deal. So I think the answer lies in intentionality and in us thinking, okay, what sort of, I mean, I've spoken a little bit about young people, so perhaps I'll just focus on that for a while. If we say, well, what sort of experiences do we want to give young people so that they grow up strong, robust, creative people who are going to take on the challenges of the world and be healthy? And then we know what sort of experiences are going to be positively formative for them and which aren't. And then we think about, well, how do we solve those problems? So I think that the technology is a tool. What we need to do is ensure that behind the tool we've got intentions and motivations, and I suppose funding to act on those intentions. If we have the intention, we want to use technology to enhance the quality of education intellectually, emotionally, and socially for young people, then the technology is going to do amazing things for us. So I think it's about looking at our incentives and motivations, and perhaps governments have a role to play as well as civil society in saying, okay, how do we incentivize people coming up with technological solutions to these issues? So, for instance, I'm sure this already exists, but how could I facilitate young people having connections with people from the other side of the globe? Some kind of electronic pen friend thing, or I'm sort of showing my age there, or how could you facilitate friendships across continents? Well, the technology already exists. It just needs some kind of structure. So I could set up a social enterprise where I connect teachers in the UK with teachers in the Gambia and in Japan and in Nicaragua. And then, I would make that available to teachers or something. So I think what we want to be doing is making sure that we're harnessing the technology to achieve the things we want to achieve. And I think we just need to have greater clarity and commitment about what we want to achieve to make the world a better place, in whatever domain we're in, whether that's education, whether that's business, whether that's healthcare. And I think what we need is more vocal leadership about that. And I think everyone can play a role, whether you're a teacher in a secondary school, whether it's me with my idea about how do I offer children more the opportunities I had. I mean, my mum's French, my dad's from Argentina. I lived in Germany for a year. It was an amazing experience. I was an exchange student when I was 18 years old. I lived with a German family, and I spent time talking with the grandmother about, her experience of the war. And it was so fascinating just to have that human conversation with her and compare that to what I was learning at school. I mean, when I went to school, kids were still going on about the Nazis and the Germans this, Germans that. The boys I went to school with were born well after the Second World War, but somehow that was part of the culture. I mean, I'm hoping that's kind of gone now. But my experience of living in Germany, going to school in Germany, living with a family means that I gained something that, I wish so many other people would gain, which is that sense of human connection with other people, different culture, but ultimately we're the same. And I felt a little bit German when I came back to the UK. I thought, and I think if we could replicate that for other people, where people could have that connection of common humanity, that'd be fantastic. I'll give you another example. 2 years ago, I went to Japan for the first time. I did some teaching in a school, and I went to a school performance where I watched the kids giving their end of year performance, and they were, on stage doing some acting and some music. I didn't understand a word because my Japanese wasn't good enough. But I had an experience which, really touched me. At one point in this watching this show, this variety show, secondary school variety show in Japan, I suddenly had this insight, if you like, that what lay behind the culture, what lay behind the language, was just young people being young people, evidencing their creativity, their teamwork. I could see all the hours they'd put into preparing this show. And the phrase that came to my mind at that time is, I believe in humanity. And what that meant for me was that what these young people were showing they were evidencing their humanity. They were evidencing being young people. And I could see that there were young people like any other young people anywhere in the world. And that was for me quite a moving experience, for me just to sort of really see that and experience that. And it was almost as if I had to not, it was almost as if not understanding the language and the culture facilitated my capacity, my ability to make that connection.
So I'm a massive fan of Japan. I think for the reasons that you outline, because every time I go there, I learn something generally about myself and my own preconceptions, because they'll, solve problems that I didn't even know existed. And sometimes it's crazy stuff, right? You just go, why would anyone do? But at least it gives you pause. And I think it's the sort of visceral nature, and I mean that in a really positive sense, of the experience of going there. The fact that you can't read, don't know what's going on, I think sometimes gives you that level of distance, and you start to reflect on things. And I found some of this, some of the things they do, I just go, well, like, I don't understand this. This doesn't make any sense. But I think about it, and I reflect on some of the things that perhaps I think we might do that for me are quote unquote better. But then there's some things that they do. I just go, why the hell don't we do that? This is brilliant. And I love that. I don't know, that challenge to my existing models. And so it's interesting in the way you were talking. I used to go, I've been there sort of about 25 times. And every time I go, I always come back with a different memory of something. And it's you just explaining that was, I think it's actually not so much about what I see of theirs, but it helps me to think about myself. I'm having my own prejudices and preconceptions and experiences challenged because I have to think about them, and I'm forced to reflect on, well, why do we do it that way? And I think that's the benefit of travel. And as you say now, actually, the technology allows us to see different things. And so that's quite exciting, I think, if we could put that in the hands of people. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that really struck me, your comment about Second World War revivalism. And it's a UK specific thing. I don't think anybody sitting in France or Germany is getting desperately excited about those times, but you're right, there's a subset of people that hark back to those things. And I do think that this part of the challenge that we have here is not opening people up to different experiences and different ideas, and understanding that actually the way that you have been doing things in your models of the world they're not the only ones, and they're by no means necessarily the best ones. And we should start thinking about what other people might, maybe someone else has got a much better way of doing things, and we should just be open to that. And so I love that the way you were talking with passion about going there really resonated with me.
I think you're absolutely right. Seeing how people do things differently and yet do other things the same is very helpful, and we know in sort of counselling and therapy that psychological flexibility is fundamental for psychological well-being. And I would say perhaps at a societal level, or flexibility too, and our ability to shift perspectives, look at things from different angles, facilitates our ability to problem solve, gain intellectual insight. It's interesting how this relates. I did some research on mindfulness with students at the University of Cambridge, and I did an MSc in educational neuroscience. And for the dissertation component, I did a follow-up study to some students who'd taken part in a big randomized control of mindfulness. And so my job was to interview the students and ask them about their perceptions of whether taking part in this mindfulness course for 6 weeks had impacted their academic performance. And one of the themes that came out from these interviews was that the ability to do mindfulness, which, by the way, is simply self-awareness, really. Mindfulness is watching what's going on in your mind in the present moment with a sort of an attitude of acceptance. So it's being an inner witness to your moment-by-moment experience. And when you do that, you notice that you've got thoughts popping up, and we've got two thinking modes. We've got an active thinking mode when we're consciously thinking something through, making a list, having this conversation, writing your opening sentence for a speech you're going to give or whatever. And then there's the sort of the passive thinking mode. And those are just all the thoughts that pop into your mind when you're lying on the couch or, in bed trying to fall asleep, and you're thinking, oh, well, I've got to do this tomorrow. What am I going to have for lunch? All that. So when you do the mindfulness, what you do is you sort of watch that default mode. You watch those passive thoughts popping up and down in your mind. And that's really helpful for a number of reasons. But the point I want to make is one of the things that these students were saying is that the ability to watch their own thought process facilitated their ability to have new intellectual insights, facilitated their ability to make a connection they hadn't otherwise made before. And then that gave them that enable them to come up with more original academic arguments, or make some connection they hadn't made before, or see how they could apply this theory to this particular set of data. So I think I'm just relating that to what we were saying about going to Japan. The ability to watch our own mind, or the ability to sort of self-observe, well, how am I running my life, or how am I running this organization, or how are we running this society in the UK, and reflect back on that, massively helpful. And I think that's facilitated when you go to a different culture, which also has old people, which also has schools, which also has transport challenges, which also has this and that. They're after all living on the same planet, but seeing how they operate through and seeing it through the lens of their culture really then helps us to say, oh, how, what could they learn from us, and what could we learn from them? So I think that's another thing we really need to be doing this century, is really massive crossover learning. And if the UK could learn everything about what the Chinese and the Japanese do really well, and vice versa, both places are going to get a massive benefit.
Wow. As ever, with guests that have fascinating topics, the hour has just flown by. So I want to say, firstly, thank you so much. It's incredibly, and I mean this in every sense, kind of you to appear on the show. I have learned a ton of things. So before I sign off with you, I want to ask you, can you just let my listeners know how they can find out more about you and your research?
Oh, well, thanks, Christian. So my kindnessadvantage.com is at kindness-advantage.com. And I've just produced a small little book which I hope empowers people to be more confident and bold champions for kindness. And it does that by giving people instant access to the latest research and science on kindness, so that people can be strong advocates for kindness without worrying that they're making a fool of themselves, and having the data-driven, research-based case for championing kindness. And that's available on Amazon now as an ebook and paperback. It'll soon be available in French, German, and Spanish. And it's called Kindness, a Pocket Guide. Kindness, a Pocket Guide by me, Sebastian Boo.
Fabulous. Links to all of those things and a ton of the things that we talked about will be in the show notes. But in the meantime, Sebastian, thank you so much for the work that you're doing, because I think it's really, really important and really fascinating. And the conversation went to spaces I wasn't expecting, which is always part of the pleasure of these sorts of conversations. But the second thing is, thank you so much again for being an amazing guest on the podcast.
Thank you.
So that's it for this first episode of the Human Risk Podcast in 2022. My huge thanks to Sebastian for appearing, and to you for listening. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a review for it, please do so on whichever platform you use to listen to it. It really does help. To find out more about human risk, the work that I do with my clients in helping them manage their human risk, visit human-risk.com, where you can find out more details and see some resources to help you manage your human risk. I will be back very soon with another episode of this show, but in the meantime, stay safe, be kind, and thanks for listening.